In the past few months, there have been a few rumors going around that new things are coming from DJI. Some people think it's a version 2 of their digital goggles, which they introduced over a year ago now. There was also another image of what could possibly be a new DJI controller, but what interested me the most were another few images that appeared on the internet that got people wondering about the possibility of DJI releasing their first actual FPV drone. Now, the photos are blurred out and no one's really confirmed anything, so whether or not the photos are real is all speculation, but they still caught my attention. Because I personally think that whether or not this is it, I still think there's a pretty good chance that they are currently working on some sort of FPV drone. And in this video, I want to talk about why I think it'll happen soon, what I think we could expect from an FPV drone made by DJI, and why I'm personally really excited for it. First, some background info. In the past few years, FPV has blown up in popularity. Because of cinematic pilots like Johnny FPV and Sam Colder, there are so many people entering the hobby from a filmmaking perspective and wanting to use FPV drones as a tool for their videos. However, there are a few limiting factors in the current state of the hobby that are stopping many people from doing so. One of these factors that becomes quickly apparent when getting started is the vast amount of knowledge and skills necessary when tuning and troubleshooting your drone. Many people entering the hobby today love the idea of learning to fly FPV, but they don't have the same time or passion for the technical side of things, like building drones, tuning, tinkering, and troubleshooting. Many people are professional or amateur filmmakers or photography drone pilots who may want to learn FPV as a service that they offer, but to them, their time is often more of a limitation than money. And spending hours on repairing drones or tuning drones may not be worth the investment. What many people want is an easy workaround. But right now in FPV, you can't really have one without the other. You can't expect to stay in the sky without learning the technical skills required to fix your drone. Anyone who gets into it will quickly realize that it's a very time-intensive hobby. Now, part of the reason there is so much to learn is because there are so many options available to you when customizing your drone. There are different motors that are different sizes and rotate at different speeds, different propellers that are different shapes of frames, and a ton of other components that offer an insane amount of customization options, which, don't get me wrong, is great if you're into that. The problem with having so many options is that you have to gain a ton of knowledge to understand which components will work best together. Along with that, learning to tune your drone to some degree is practically inevitable because each combination of components will behave and perform in different ways. Then you have the setup of the drone where you have to pair all of the equipment and make sure that your components are working and communicating with each other. Overall, there just isn't a lot of standardization of both components and processes. But as a result, you can customize your drone to your style, needs, and preferences. Again, this is not a bad thing, and many people love this part of the hobby. And I'd say that until the last few years, you had to love this part of the hobby because otherwise there was no way you were going to stick to it. But even today, with a growing catalog of videos on YouTube, there is still a ton of research that you have to do if you want to get started in FPV and stick to it. Now, if I was to choose one big reason for all of this, I'd say it's because the FPV hobby is still in its pretty early stages, where things are quickly developing and many small innovations are happening constantly. Because of that, it doesn't provide the same type of accessibility as other more established technologies do. I don't want to go into this into too much detail, but when a new technology comes around, there are typically 5 different segments of consumers that adopt the new tech. There are the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. In my opinion, the people getting into FPV right now are somewhere in between the early adopters and the early majority. It's clearly starting to gain a lot of attention, but it doesn't yet appeal to as wide of an audience as it could, partially because of this high barrier of entry, which is where I think DJI could actually help. And before I get into it, I just want to remind you guys that, first of all, this is all speculation. None of this has been confirmed in any way. And two, this is completely my own opinion, so take it with a grain of salt. But this is why I think a DJI FPV drone could actually benefit the community. Currently, DJI is probably the most polarizing company in the FPV world right now. Most people know them for their really popular range of consumer-grade camera drones, but a bit over a year ago, they decided to make their grand entrance into the FPV market as well, with their HD digital system. Now, the new digital system is still not perfect, but it was a pretty big leap forward. It also started a wave of innovation, with other companies now trying harder than ever to push the existing limits of FPV video quality, which, in my opinion, will only end up benefiting the hobby. The problem is, since DJI is a current powerhouse in the consumer drone market, with a lot more money and power than the existing equipment manufacturers, many people are concerned about the possibility of them running many of these smaller companies out of business, and eventually having a monopoly like they currently kind of do over the photography drone market. And honestly, I think that's a pretty fair concern. But the more I think about it, and the more I try to imagine what a DJI designed FPV drone would actually look like, the less convinced I am that that would happen. And I feel like there could be more benefits than drawbacks. Of course, we don't know what the drone is actually going to look like, and anything is possible, but there are a few things that I think we could expect. First, specialization and accessibility. The consumer DJI drones on the market today, like the Mavic and the Mavic Mini, are specialized to be good at two things: taking slow cinematic videos and photography. Because of that, they make those things fairly easy. There was a time when the experience of operating a camera drone was solely available to highly specialized individuals, but DJI came in, simplified the process, and made it accessible to the average consumer. The reason they chose those industries as their specialty was probably a calculated decision as well. If the amount of filmmaking and photography tutorials on YouTube and the success of those channels proves anything, I'd say that filmmakers and content creators are one of the biggest underserved markets for FPV drones. However, since many don't have a technical background, they are also the most affected by the current barriers of entry and could be more easily deterred. It only makes sense to me that DJI would want to capture that market. So what I'm thinking is, if DJI releases an FPV drone, there's a good chance that it might be specialized as well. It most likely wouldn't be made for racing or for freestyle, but for a market that they've already been pursuing, the filmmakers. Then, just like with their current lineup of drones, they might decide on the flight characteristics that they want, design a drone around them, and then force the consumer to accept what they propose to be the optimal setup. Then, if the new FPV drone was optimized to fly a certain way, this could result in a single frame, one type of propeller, one type of battery, one size of motor, and all of these things optimized for smooth, flowy, cinematic shots, the kind that we associate with cinematic FPV. This would take away all the need for learning about different components and how they work together, because there will only be one option. Learning these things would become a choice instead of a necessity. This would of course benefit DJI because they would end up just selling more of their own products, but it would also benefit the consumer because it would give them less to worry about. Then it would also help simplify the other part of the hobby, setting it all up. Currently, many FPV companies have started to offer pre-built bind and fly drones that are meant to make it easier for people to get started. But even now, before you get them up in the air, you still have to learn a few things. You still might have to first set up your receiver correctly in Betaflight, set up a profile for your drone in your controller, bind the controller, figure out what video band and channel your drone is on so you can match it in your goggles, since auto scan is often unreliable. And depending on the drone and receiver you have, there might be some other steps, such as setting up your arming switch, flashing some firmware, or troubleshooting any problems that come up along the way. When DJI introduced their current FPV system, they simplified as many of the steps in that process as they could, and made pairing all of the equipment almost as easy as a single press of a button. In my opinion, the biggest part of this that still remains an issue is that pilots still have to use a software like Betaflight for the rest of the setup. I predict that if DJI made an FPV drone, they would probably scrap the need for a third-party software entirely. With their specifically selected parts, they could ship the drone tuned and ready to go. Instead, I wouldn't be surprised if they allowed small adjustments to your rates, PIDs, and preferences in the goggles on-screen display, and just left it at that. This would greatly limit the customization options again, but for many new people entering the hobby, I firmly believe that this is a trade-off they wouldn't just happily make, but also pay a premium for. Finally, one of the last barriers that exist are the need to fix your drone. With heavy impacts being inevitable, FPV drones aren't expected to last a lifetime, and soldering wires intimidates a lot of people. There are a few companies that tried to address this problem, and drones like the TBS Oblivion or the Beagle drone use something called bullet connectors for their motor wires. These allow you to swap out your old motors by just unplugging them and plugging in new ones with no soldering required. I'm not sure if these are the absolute best solution, but I wouldn't be surprised if DJI ended up creating an entire quick swap system as well, allowing consumers to avoid soldering entirely. I also wouldn't be surprised if they made the frame a little bit more bulky and protective, similarly to what we see today with Cinewhoops, or what the TBS Oblivion did by using durable plastic instead of carbon fiber. The potentially leaked photos that were released would confirm this as well, showing what seems to be a protective plastic frame. Bulkier frames tend to limit mobility to some degree, but since cinematic flying consists of less abrupt movements, I definitely think that they could find some sort of middle ground between protection and performance where they can make it work. Having an enclosed frame would protect its components from heavier impacts, and if something still breaks, having easily swappable parts would allow people to spend a few extra dollars for an easy fix instead of having to invest the time. I then started thinking about a few other questions, such as whether or not the drones will be limited to DJI branded batteries, and whether or not they will come with an integrated camera. Honestly, I don't know, but I'd say they probably would end up making their own batteries. As for the camera, it would be nice if they still allowed any action camera to be used with it, but if that's the case, I'd guess that they'll probably still do some sort of direct integration with their Osmo action camera just to promote sales. But I guess we'll find out. But overall, I just think that if DJI does release a drone that is even remotely similar to that, I don't think it's going to take that much away from the hobby. I think by making a drone that is more accessible, we'll only get more people interested in FPV and end up greatly expanding the community. I think the option to build a customized FPV drone will still exist, and anyone who will want to do that will be able to do so. I just think that DJI will take advantage of a large gap in the market of people who would love FPV and are just too intimidated to try it out. Then, as more pilots get more familiar with their DJI drone, they might start wanting a more customized FPV quad, and their interest in the tinkering side of the hobby might grow. And that would bring more interest and money to the smaller companies as well. Sure, new technologies will force the smaller companies to innovate, and yes, some companies who fail to do so may go bankrupt. But overall, I think there is still room in the industry for many others. But maybe I'm just optimistic about it. I should also mention that another concern that many people have is that with more drones in the sky, drone laws will get stricter in many countries. But let's be real, we're already seeing that happening. I really think at this point it's inevitable. And at least with more pilots, we might have a larger community to voice our side of things and hopefully end up with laws that are more reasonable. But then again, those are just my thoughts. I'm not an expert. Honestly, I'd love to know what you guys think about all this as well. So please let me know in the comment section below. That's all I have for today. Guys, thanks again for watching. I appreciate every single one of you, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.